Can you believe that the greatest, most devastating catastrophe in ancient history, a war that would shatter kings, reduce a glorious city to smoldering rubble, and leave the sands stained crimson for generations, started over a single glittering piece of fruit? A small golden apple, tossed down by a goddess who was not invited to the party. This is not a tale of strategy or grand military genius. Not yet. This is the story of how the immortal gods, in their terrifying vanity and jealousy, decided to play a game with human lives as the chips, initiating a decade-long siege that would forever define the meaning of heroic tragedy. You are about to fall deep into the story of Troy. But be warned, once you hear the full scale of the madness, you may never look at the world the same way again. Before the ships sailed, before the swords were drawn, before the mighty walls of Ilium felt the first tremor of doom, there was a wedding. A celebration so magnificent it was held on Mount Olympus itself, bringing together every god, every nymph, and every powerful being in the cosmos. The sea nymph Thetis, whose beauty was famed across the oceans, was being married to the mortal hero Peleus. This union, decreed by fate, was meant to be the pinnacle of divine and mortal harmony, a perfect night of celestial bliss and flowing ambrosia. But the fates are cruel jesters, and perfection is only ever one missed detail away from total annihilation. While the Olympian halls thundered with laughter, and Zeus himself toasted the happy couple, one vital, volatile guest had been deliberately excluded: Eris. Eris, the goddess of discord, of strife, of chaos itself. Can you fathom the arrogance? To hold the biggest party in the universe and consciously leave out the embodiment of trouble. They feared her presence, of course, knowing her very breath could curdle the wine and turn laughter into screams. But in keeping her out, they only succeeded in guaranteeing their own doom. Eris did not simply leave. Eris does not forgive, and she certainly does not forget an insult. She waited for the perfect, most catastrophic moment to unleash her revenge. And it wasn't a sword or a plague she chose. It was something far more insidious, something designed to exploit the very weakness she knew resided in the hearts of the great goddesses: their unbearable, overwhelming vanity. She swept into the wedding feast, unseen by the revelers, a shadowy, furious presence moving through the golden halls. And with a single contemptuous flick of her wrist, Eris launched her weapon directly onto the banquet table, where it rolled and shimmered under the golden light, drawing all eyes to its deadly perfection. It was the golden apple, polished smooth and engraved with 3 simple, fatal words. 3 words that cracked the foundation of Olympus and set the stage for the fall of Troy. Callisti, to the fairest one. The music stopped. The laughter died in a choked gasp. The air thickened with competitive venom as the goddesses realized what had just transpired. that single, unassuming apple now held the title of the universe's most beautiful woman. And the gods, those supposed paragons of wisdom, instantly devolved into squabbling children, their immortal pride wounded by the mere implication of a challenge. 3 goddesses immediately stepped forward, their eyes blazing with possessive fury, each certain that the apple belonged to her and her alone. First, there was Hera, the mighty queen of heaven, wife of Zeus, whose regal bearing and power were unmatched. Next came Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic war, cloaked in her intellectual brilliance and martial prowess, utterly convinced that true beauty resided in cunning and tactical superiority. And finally, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, desire, and physical perfection, whose very presence could stop the breath of gods and men alike, radiating an intoxicating, undeniable aura of pure, raw sensuality. This was the beginning of the end. The 3 most powerful women in the cosmos locked in a silent, deadly stare-down over a piece of fruit tossed by a forgotten guest. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, each demanding the apple, each refusing to yield even an inch of their divine ego. Can you imagine the pressure on Zeus, their king? He, the ultimate adjudicator, was trapped. To choose Hera meant the fury of Athena and Aphrodite. To choose Athena meant the destabilization of his marriage. To choose Aphrodite meant eternal strife among his inner council. The choice was impossible, the consequences unthinkable. And so, Zeus did what any panicked, powerful ruler does when faced with an unsolvable political crisis. He outsourced the decision. He washed his hands of the mess and decided to delegate this catastrophic judgment to the most unlikely and perhaps most tragic figure imaginable, a mortal shepherd living far away on the slopes of Mount Ida. He had chosen Paris, the neglected prince of Troy, raised in exile, unaware of his royal lineage, beautiful, charming, and utterly, fatefully foolish. He was about to be dragged from his simple life tending sheep and plunged headfirst into the ultimate divine beauty contest. A contest where the stakes were not just pride, but the very existence of his homeland. Zeus commanded Hermes, the swift messenger of the gods, to take the 3 furious goddesses down to Mount Ida, to present themselves naked before Paris, and to force him to declare which of them was Callisti, to the fairest one. Think about that mandate. The highest queen, the wisest warrior, and the embodiment of desire, standing before a young, untested mortal. The temptation was overwhelming, the pressure absolute, and the bribery that followed was magnificent in its terror. Hera promised him unmatched political power, promising to make him the undisputed king of Asia, ruler of all mortal lands, master of unimaginable wealth and armies. Athena offered him unparalleled military glory, promising that he would never lose a battle, that he would be the wisest and most feared warrior the world had ever known, guaranteeing eternal fame through conquest. But Aphrodite, the subtle master of mortal hearts, she offered him something far more dangerous, something that would appeal directly to the young man's deepest, most reckless desire. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, the wife of another king, the legendary Helen of Sparta. And in that moment, when Paris looked at the golden apple, and then looked into the intoxicating eyes of the goddess of love, he made a choice that sealed the fate of Troy, signing the death warrant for thousands of men and igniting the 10-year inferno we call the Trojan War. The catastrophe was now inevitable, and the first ship was already being built in the shadow of this fatal, glittering prize. The apple had been delivered. The judgment was about to be rendered, and the world was about to break. The world held its breath, but the man chosen to deliver the death blow was entirely oblivious. Paris, son of King Priam, was not lounging in the golden halls of Troy. He was exiled, a lonely shepherd on the rugged pine-strewn slopes of Mount Ida. His life was spent guarding flocks, not empires, which made Zeus's choice exquisitely, terribly ironic. He was pure of heart, uncomplicated by the toxic politics of the Olympians, and therefore, perhaps, the most easily corrupted by their divine promises. Zeus, the mighty Sky Father, knew better than to handle Eris's grenade. To choose one goddess meant creating two eternal, vengeful enemies, and the stability of Olympus itself was far too fragile to risk that kind of internal war. So, with a deep sigh that rumbled like distant, ominous thunder across the Aegean, he commanded the quicksilver messenger god, Hermes, to take the golden prize and deliver the trio of celestial fury to the feet of the Trojan prince. "Let a mortal decide," Zeus decreed, washing his hands of the catastrophe, thereby ensuring that the catastrophe would fall squarely upon the heads of mortals, beginning with the unsuspecting Paris. Imagine the scene. Three beings of absolute, blinding, transcendent glory descending upon a simple mortal tending his sheep. Hera, the queen of heaven, regal, draped in peacock feathers and radiating the icy power of lawful authority, stepped first onto the dusty ground. Next was Athena, the warrior goddess, intellect sharp as a spear point, clad in polished bronze, the very definition of strategic, unforgiving brilliance, her presence instantly chilling the air around them. The goddesses did not rely on charm to sway the judge. They relied on temptation, tailored precisely and cruelly to the desires they perceived in the young prince's soul, offering him the ultimate test of character, power, glory, or passion. Hera stepped forward, her voice like the chime of distant, priceless gold, offering Paris a crown that stretched far beyond the familiar walls of Troy. She promised him dominion over all of Asia, a political empire so vast, so powerful, that his name would become synonymous with unquestioned imperial might, making him the richest, most feared ruler the world had ever known.
This was the bribe of the throne, the intoxicating allure of absolute political destiny. Athena's offer was entirely different, a siren call to the warrior soul that Paris didn't even know he possessed.
She promised him victory in every single battle, unmatched military genius, and eternal, unblemished glory. He would be remembered not just as a king, but as a legend, a master tactician whose name would be invoked whenever men spoke of courage and cunning, a legacy carved in the granite of history. The promise was simple: immortality through unparalleled martial achievement, safe from the corrosion of time. But Aphrodite understood the hidden heart, the secret, burning desire that drives all men, even shepherds pretending to be common, the thing that logic cannot touch and power cannot control. She offered neither land nor glory, neither political power nor military fame. She offered raw, devastating, world-shattering love. She promised him the most beautiful woman in the entire world, Helen of Sparta. A woman whose face was literally crafted by the gods to launch 1,000 ships, a masterpiece of human form whose presence alone was a weapon of mass distraction. The weight of the world, the fate of 2 continents, rested on this single, selfish, overwhelming desire to possess that which was forbidden, that which was perfect. Paris, gazing upon Aphrodite's breathtaking perfection, and blinded by the vision of Helen that the goddess conjured in his mind's eye, pointed his trembling finger. He chose the bribe of passion. He chose Aphrodite. He chose the most beautiful woman on earth, and in that agonizing moment, he signed the death warrant for his entire civilization. The Abel of Discord, the trigger for the entire war, was now passed to the goddess of love, a prize bought with 1,000,000 lives yet to be lost. But the cost of that victory was the instantaneous, unholy wrath of the 2 most powerful, most vindictive women in the entire cosmos, Hera and Athena. Their fury was not a passing summer storm. It was a divine commitment to total annihilation. They would hunt Troy down, not just for the offense to their pride, but because they had been publicly humiliated by a mere mortal, shamed in front of their eternal peers on Olympus. The shepherd was gone, replaced by the prince, now arrogant, entitled, and utterly consumed by his promised prize. He had to go to Sparta. He had to meet Helen. The logistics of kidnapping the wife of a powerful Greek king, Menelaus, were entirely irrelevant to the man newly blessed by Aphrodite. Divine favor makes men foolishly brave and blind to consequence.
King Priam, overjoyed to find his long-lost handsome son, quickly equipped a grand fleet, a dazzling embassy sailing under the highly deceptive guise of diplomatic relations, never guessing that this luxurious voyage was merely the Trojan horse setting sail before the actual war began.
The magnificent ships cut through the wine-dark sea, carrying Paris and his destiny toward Lacedaemon, toward Menelaus's court, toward the woman who was already technically married, already a mother, and already the most dangerous person alive, simply by existing. The prophecy was fulfilled, the judgment rendered, and the world was waiting for Helen to make her choice. And the true, unstoppable war machine was finally starting to grind its terrible gears into motion. The silence after Paris made his choice was not peace. It was the suffocating calm before the hurricane ripped the world apart. Aphrodite, the weaver of irresistible fate, wasted not a moment. The prize had been earned, and now it had to be collected, regardless of the blood that would inevitably stain the earth in its retrieval. The goddess of love, whose power transcended mortal will, guided Paris straight to Sparta, the fortress of Menelaus, the man whose honor was about to be obliterated, and whose kingdom would soon burn to ash. Menelaus, king of Sparta, was tragically absent, dealing with some insignificant funeral rites on the island of Crete, an errand that would forever haunt his waking hours. While the lion was away, the jackal entered the den, and Paris found Helen, the most coveted woman in all creation, waiting. Was she hypnotized by divine power, swayed by the sheer, devastating beauty of the Trojan prince? Or did she willingly choose to forsake the comfortable, predictable crown of Sparta for the explosive, dangerous thrill of a destined journey? We may never know the precise chemical reaction that occurred that day, but the result was indisputable. Helen, carrying the destiny of 2 continents on her shoulders, departed with Paris, taking not just herself, but also a massive cache of Menelaus's royal treasure, gold, silver, and priceless heirlooms, turning the act of elopement into a grand, unforgivable act of state theft. They sailed under the moon, their ship cutting through the Aegean, leaving behind an emptied palace and a void that would soon fill with the screaming fury of the Achaean world. For Paris, the journey was a dizzying triumph of lust and divine favor, a spectacular prize won at the cost of every life soon to be extinguished on the plains of Troy. For Helen, it was the beginning of an exile that would define every subsequent century of history, making her name synonymous with beauty, betrayal, and catastrophic war. When Menelaus finally returned to the stark silence of his throne room, the realization hit him like a thunderbolt hurled by Zeus himself. His wife was gone. His wealth was gone. His honor was not just damaged, it had been surgically removed and tossed into the sea. The rage that consumed the Spartan king was not the typical anger of a betrayed husband.
It was the calculated, cold fury of a monarch whose entire legacy had been spat upon by a foreign upstart. He did not weep. He swore an oath that the entire civilization of Troy would pay the ultimate terrifying price for this arrogance. He knew exactly what to do. Years before, when Helen was merely a marriageable girl whose beauty threatened to ignite civil war among the Achaean princes, her foster father, Tyndareus, had demanded a sacred vow, the Oath of Tyndareus. Every single Greek hero, every prince, every commander who had once sought Helen's hand had sworn that if anyone dared to steal her, they would unite and bring the full crushing weight of their armies down upon the perpetrator. Now, that ancient promise, that terrifying mutual protection pact, was being invoked. Menelaus immediately sailed for Mycenae, the seat of his brother, Agamemnon, the High King, the man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the sea itself. Agamemnon, the King of Kings, did not need convincing. This was more than justice. It was the geopolitical opportunity he had been waiting for. A war against the fabulously wealthy city of Troy, a city that controlled the Hellespont trade routes, would not just reclaim Helen, it would cement his dynasty as the unquestioned ruler of the entire Aegean. The call went out, a command wrapped in the cloak of sacred duty, demanding that every sworn man honor the oath. The ships began to gather, slowly at first, then in a roaring torrent, converging on Aulis. But even with the divine mandate and the oath of Tyndareus, not everyone was eager to trade their peaceful lives and fruitful harvests for 10 years of brutal, bloody slaughter on a foreign shore. Two men, in particular, knew the stakes were too high, and they had every intention of evading the destiny that the Fates and Agamemnon were demanding. These were the two pillars upon which the entire success of the expedition rested: the brilliant, reluctant Odysseus and the unparalleled, furious Achilles. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, renowned for his cunning and foresight, had consulted the seers. He knew that if he went to Troy, the war would last a decade, and his journey home would take another decade, leaving his son Telemachus fatherless for 20 years. That price was simply too high. When Agamemnon's envoys arrived, led by the shrewd Palamedes, they found Odysseus plowing his fields, not with oxen, but with an ass and an ox yoked together, pulling the plow erratically. Furthermore, instead of sowing grain, the king of Ithaca was scattering salt across the fertile earth, a clear sign of profound, dangerous lunacy. The moment of truth arrived. The false lunatic instantly swerved the plow to avoid crushing his heir. The mask of madness shattered. Odysseus may have been reluctant, but he was undeniably sane. And now he was caught. He was honor-bound to join the war, but he would never forgive Palamedes for that cruel, necessary trick. The other essential piece of Agamemnon's puzzle was Achilles, the demigod's son of the sea nymph Thetis,
whose spear alone was worth 10,000 soldiers. The prophecy surrounding Achilles was terrifyingly clear. He would achieve unimaginable glory at Troy, becoming the most famous hero in history, but he would die there.
Thetis knew this absolute truth. She could not bear to lose her son to a glorious, early grave. So she whisked the young warrior away, hiding him on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl named Pyrrha, amongst the daughters of King Lycomedes.
Achilles, the future destroyer of men, was forced to wear women's robes, learn to spin wool, and live in the suffocating luxury of the palace women's quarters, his legendary battle-hungry spirit chafing under the silk and silence. But the great seer Calchas had told the Achaeans that Troy absolutely could not fall without the son of Thetis. Once again, it was the cunning of Odysseus, now fully committed, that saved the day. Odysseus and Diomedes sailed to Skyros, bringing with them a chest of treasures intended for the king's daughters, fine jewelry, silks, perfumes, but also, crucially, a magnificent, gleaming bronze shield and a spear of perfect balance. While the king's daughters rushed to examine the feminine trinkets, the disguised Achilles, forgetting his role entirely in the presence of true weapons, immediately lunged for the shield and spear. The deception was over. The greatest warrior of the age was exposed, and the terrible prophecy could no longer be denied. Achilles was ready to answer the call, trading the safety of obscurity for the certainty of eternal glory and inevitable death. The final pieces were in place. The entire world was mobilizing, driven by a stolen wife, a broken oath, and the insatiable ambition of kings. The 1,000 ships of the Achaeans were ready to sail, and the age of heroes was about to end in fire. The world was not just holding its breath. The very air was thick with the dust of 1,000,000 marching feet. The shores of Aulis, that fateful, cursed stretch of coast, were choked solid with the infrastructure of utter destruction. They called it the Catalogue of Ships, but that ancient ledger does not convey the sheer terror of seeing 1,200 hulls bristling with 10,000 bronze shields, packed so tightly you could walk across the Aegean without getting your feet wet. Agamemnon, the king of kings, stood at the apex of this terrifying machine. His arrogance, magnified by the unprecedented loyalty of his brother rulers, made him an immovable object ready to meet the impenetrable wall of Troy. He commanded more men, more resources, and more pride than any Greek before or since. Yet even this monumental effort was destined to stumble, not on the battlefield, but right here, before they even set sail. The assembled heroes were a gallery of legends. Odysseus, the cunning master of schemes. Menelaus, burning with a righteous rage that fueled the entire endeavor. Ajax, a mountain of muscle whose fury was only contained by his shield. And, of course, Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, cloaked in his own dark destiny. They had gathered, they had prayed,
They had provisioned for a war that would last decades. But when Agamemnon gave the order to lift anchor, the sea lay flat and silent. The sails hung limp, useless canvases, defying the will of the King of Kings.
A terrible, grinding silence descended upon Aulis. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the mighty Achaean fleet was trapped, held hostage by an invisible, divine force. The men grew restless, the supplies dwindled, and the greatest army ever assembled began to rot in place, morale evaporating like morning mist. This agonizing blockage was no accident of weather. It was the calculated revenge of a slighted deity. The terrible truth had to be unearthed, and for that, they turned to the one man they feared more than any enemy, Calchas, the High Seer. Calchas, whose eyes saw the threads of fate woven by the gods, stepped forward, his voice a dry whisper carrying the weight of the inevitable. The wind would not return, he declared, because the huntress goddess, Artemis, was deeply, murderously offended. Agamemnon, in a fit of drunken pride months earlier, had committed the ultimate transgression. He had slain one of Artemis's sacred stags, a beast of unearthly beauty, and then, in a moment of catastrophic hubris, boasted that even the goddess herself could not have made a cleaner kill. Such vanity cannot stand against Olympus. Artemis had shut down the wind, freezing the very air over. Such vanity cannot stand against Olympus. Artemis had shut down the wind, freezing the very air over the sea, and she demanded a price far heavier than any treasure or sacrifice of livestock. The price for the wind, the price for Troy, was the blood of an innocent. The seer's awful gaze fixed upon Agamemnon. The goddess demands. The seer's awful gaze fixed upon Agamemnon. The goddess demands your eldest daughter, Calchas pronounced, the fair Iphigenia. Only her sacrifice can appease the divine wrath and loosen the sails of Greece.
Agamemnon, the man who would burn 10,000 lives to reclaim his brother's wife, found himself trapped by his own ambition. The king wept, he raged, he pleaded with the gods, but the silence of the flat sea was his only answer. A fraudulent message was sent back to Mycenae, dripping with sweet lies. It claimed that Achilles, the glorious warrior, had agreed to marry Iphigenia, uniting the mightiest house of Argos with the great hero of Phthia. Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's queen, blinded by the prestige of this match, joyfully sent her daughter to Aulis, dressed not for death, but for a wedding. The most celebrated match in the world was, in reality, a gruesome, cold-blooded execution. Achilles, learning of the appalling lie used in his name, exploded in a rage
that nearly cost Agamemnon his life right there on the shore. He felt his honor, that precious, singular currency of the heroic age, had been utterly violated by the king's deceit. The hero of Phthia vowed to defend the girl, sword drawn, but the entire army, desperate for the winds to blow, began to turn against him. Their decade-long journey was worth more to them than one maiden's life. It was Achilles, the man who would eventually refuse to fight for the Achaeans, who stood ready to fight the entire Achaean host just to save the innocent girl, highlighting the terrifying moral decay that had already set in before the war even began. But Iphigenia, in a moment of heartbreaking, ultimate patriotism, or perhaps sheer, overwhelming terror, made her own choice. Seeing the chaos, understanding the weight of the 1,000 ships, she offered herself willingly. As the blade descended, as the crimson moment of ultimate horror was about to stain the history of the world, a blinding flash of light erupted from the altar. Divine intervention. Artemis, either momentarily satiated or perhaps moved by the girl's noble self-sacrifice, snatched Iphigenia away at the last second, replacing her with a beautiful stag upon the altar, the air immediately filled with the scent of wild blood and the terrifying roar of the returned winds. They sailed, 1,200 black ships cutting through the Aegean, a storm of bronze and fury driven by a king who had sacrificed his own blood for a favorable wind. The sheer weight of this armada, the greatest mobilization the world had ever known, should have been enough to blot out the sun. But the gods, those cruel, capricious architects of human pain, were not yet done with their games. The journey itself was a testament to the fact that divine anger rarely grants a direct route to vengeance. The first year was swallowed whole by the vast, deceptive blue, and while the charts they followed were meticulously drawn, the compass they trusted was spun by the mischievous hand of a vengeful deity. They were destined to suffer the humiliation of a false start, to prove that even the most powerful human alliance is nothing more than a toy to Olympus. Instead of the golden ramparts and the glorious Scaean gate, they landed upon the rugged, unsuspecting coasts of Mysia, a territory far south of their target. Agamemnon, blinded by ambition and the relentless rocking of the sea, declared with the arrogance of a supreme commander that they had found their prize. The battle commenced instantly, a horrific miscalculation fueled by bloodlust, exhaustion, and the desperate need to finally do something after months of miserable travel. This was not strategy. This was pure, unalterated Greek fury, unleashed upon the wrong people. Telephus, the king of this unfortunate land, a man born of Heracles' mighty line, stood defiant, a magnificent, bronze-clad anachronism. He believed himself defending his homeland against mere raiders, and he fought with the strength of a demigod, protecting his legacy. The clash of their bronze shields echoed across the sea, a deafening declaration that even far from Troy, the war god Ares was already feasting. In a flash of lethal speed, Achilles' great spear, the weapon crafted by Chiron the centaur and inherited from his father, found its mark, piercing Telephus's thigh.
The Mysian king fell, not dead, but critically injured, the pain immediately beginning its slow, agonizing work. The wound was strange, deep, and utterly unnatural, for it festered immediately, refusing to close, poisoning his very existence with mystical, unending pain. The Greeks quickly realized their grievous error. They had spilled the wrong blood on the wrong sand. They had wasted precious time and the lifeblood of their finest men. Humiliated and utterly adrift, the massive Greek fleet was scattered again by fierce, spiteful storms, forcing them to retreat entirely. The voyage stalled, the grand ambition curdled into frustration. They returned to the familiar shores of Aulis, where they had first gathered, the scene of Iphigenia's sacrifice, the curse clinging to the salt air.
A full 10 years passed in this state of miserable limbo, a forgotten decade of regrouping, supply failures, and divine confusion. A decade before the actual siege even began, a dark testament to the difficulty of crossing the god's will.
During this lost decade, Telephus, agonizing relentlessly in Mysia, consulted the sacred oracle in Delphi, his pain driving him to the very edge of madness. The decree was terrifyingly precise and deeply strange, echoing in the smoky chamber. The wounder shall be the healer.
The great Telephus, king and warrior, was reduced to desperation. He knew exactly what he must do. He had to find the man whose blade had nearly ended him, the very source of his endless torment. He traveled across the Aegean, a king reduced to a pathetic, limping beggar, his royal dignity exchanged for the hope of a simple, painless sleep. He sought Achilles, the catalyst of his agony, the only man who held the key to his salvation. The scene at the Greek camp, still reeling from the decade of false starts, was a theater of the absurd. The greatest hero of the Achaeans being begged for a cure by the very man he had nearly killed by mistake. Achilles, always more comfortable with slaughter than medicine, was initially perplexed and arrogant.
He claimed he knew nothing of healing, only of hacking, only of the glorious art of killing. But the sly, silver-tongued Odysseus, who saw the threads of fate woven into every disaster, understood the true intent of the oracle. He realized the spear itself, the divine instrument of fate and destruction, held the power. It was not the hero's hand, but the hero's weapon. They scraped the flakes of reddish rust from the sacred bronze, the very particles of the metal that had delivered the wound, and applied them like a strange metallic poultice to the festering injury.
Instantly, miraculously, the decade of agony vanished. The wound closed, the poisoning ceased, Telephus was whole, and fate demanded his payment for this impossible cure. He was indebted to the very army that had nearly destroyed him, and he offered them precisely what they lacked: knowledge of the true, unconfused route to Troy. The confusion was over. The 10 years of wandering, the terrible sacrifice at Aulis, the brutal mistake at Mysia, all served one purpose: to ensure the fleet arrived, finally, at the correct coordinates of doom, precisely when the gods decreed it. Now, guided by a man who knew every inlet, every treacherous reef, and every divine current leading to the golden fortress, the 1,200 ships turned their prows toward the Hellespont. The true war was about to begin, and the walls of Troy, silent and unsuspecting, were about to hear the screams of the mightiest army ever assembled under the banner of a betrayed king. The sea churned, not just with the passage of 1,000 ships, but with the palpable wrath of Menelaus and the desperate ambition of Agamemnon. The sheer scale of the landing force was a spectacle of terror, a sprawling, dark stain spreading across the brilliant azure of the Aegean. Troy, magnificent and defiant, watched from its impossibly high ramparts, its defenders gripping spears, their hearts pounding a rhythm of doomed defense.
A chilling prophecy hung over the fleet, like a shroud woven by the fates themselves. The first man to leap from his ship and touch the sand of the Troad would be claimed by Hades, a bloody down payment for the war. For a moment, the unstoppable tide of heroes stalled, paralyzed by ancient superstition, a testament to the paralyzing power of divine decree. Even the mighty Ajax, shield like a tower, hesitated, and Odysseus, cunning master of calculation, held his breath, waiting for a fool or hero to break the spell.
But then the spell broke, shattered by the impetuous courage of Protesilaus, son of Iphiclus, the very image of Thessalian bravery. He was young, newly married, and driven by a thirst for immortal glory that blinded him to the grim certainty of his doom. With a scream that was half battle cry, half final farewell, he launched himself into the churning surf, his feet sinking into the wet sands of his execution ground. His immediate, brutal end was the gruesome key that unlocked the floodgates of the invasion. Seeing the prophecy fulfilled and the curse lifted, the Greeks roared, a collective sound that shook the very foundation of the earth. Myrmidons, Aetolians, Locrians, they poured from the beached ships, thousands upon thousands, a metal storm surging toward the makeshift Trojan defenses on the plain. The battle for the beachhead was instantaneous and utterly savage, a churning vortex of bronze and screaming muscle. The Trojans, however, were not merely sheep for the slaughter. Led by the towering, almost impossibly noble Hector, they met the landing with a desperate ferocity, born of defending home and hearth. The fighting was horrific, a chaotic grinder where men lost their lives for mere inches of soil. For weeks, the Achaeans could not penetrate further than the sandy plain surrounding the city, finding themselves locked in a brutal stalemate against the impenetrable fortifications. This wasn't a quick raid, it was a siege, and a siege required resources, food, and, most crucially, plunder to keep the vast army motivated and fed. The Greeks realized quickly that the walls of Troy were too high, too thick, too daunting for an immediate assault. They needed to starve the city, isolate it, and, in the meantime, finance their own existence, leading to a profound shift in military strategy.
And so, the war devolved into a grinding campaign of regional terror that lasted nearly a decade. The mighty Achaean heroes, led by Achilles, the swift-footed, began systematically dismantling the surrounding kingdom's allies and supply lines. They scattered into raiding parties, striking at the wealthy Phrygian cities and the Dardanian towns dotting the countryside, turning the siege into a war of attrition and regional conquest.
This was the dark, necessary underbelly of the grand siege, filling the coffers and stomachs of the invaders while simultaneously isolating Troy from any hope of reinforcement or resupply. Achilles, that burning star of fury, became the true terror of the Troad. His speed and skill were unmatched. He was a hurricane of destruction that swept through city after city, leaving ruin and corpses in his wake. He stormed Lyrnessus and Pedasus, slaughtering their defenders and seizing immense treasure. It was during these relentless, bloody excursions that the true prizes were taken, the young women destined to become concubines, objects of war, and eventual catalysts for greater strife, stripped of their homes and dignity, bound by chains of bronze and fate. Among the spoils of these raids were 2 women whose fates would intertwine with the greatest heroes and ignite a devastating feud that nearly cost the Greeks the entire war. There was the fair-skinned Briseis, captured from Lyrnessus, destined for the tent of Achilles, a comfort and a mark of his unparalleled success on the battlefield.
And there was the beautiful Chryseis, daughter of Chryses, a venerable priest of the far-shooting god Apollo, who was awarded to the high king Agamemnon as a testament to his supreme authority over the Achaean host. These women were not just prizes. They were walking time bombs, ticking down to the moment the gods would decide to interfere again.
For 9 grueling years, this was the ugly rhythm of the Trojan War. Periods of intense, bloody clashes on the plain, followed by long, agonizing lulls as the Greeks raided for supplies. The walls of Troy held firm, an impossible bastion against the wrath of the Achaean horde, a monument to the resilience of Priam's ancient lineage. The true test of endurance wasn't the battles, but the soul-crushing boredom, the disease, and the endless waiting that tested the loyalty of every man camped beside the wine-dark sea, eroding their discipline and faith. But the gods, who had started this entire catastrophe with a golden apple and a petty wedding snub, were far from finished toying with mortal men. The capture of Chryseis, the daughter of Apollo's devoted priest, was a transgression that could not go unpunished by Olympus. The siege was about to face a far deadlier foe than the spears of Hector, the swift, invisible arrows of the sun god himself, bringing plague and pestilence to the sprawling camp. The stage was set, the tension thick as blood. For the moment, the High King's pride would finally crack the Achaean alliance in two and unleash the true horror of the war.
The stench of unburned bodies hung like a shroud over the 1,000 ships. Apollo, the golden archer, was not missing his mark. His invisible arrows, pestilence itself, struck down men by the score every single hour. For 9 days, the slaughter had been silent, internal, and horrifyingly efficient, weakening the Achaean host more than any Trojan spear ever could.
The greatest military force ever assembled was dissolving, not under siege fire, but under the wrath of a single insulted god. High King Agamemnon, his face a mask of sweating imperial fear, finally bowed to the inevitable and called a full assembly. Beneath the scorching sun, the 10,000 best warriors looked less like conquerors and more like condemned men waiting for the executioner's signal. Achilles, the swift-footed, stood tall, radiating an impatient, almost bored power. His eyes narrowed, already suspecting the depth of the High King's catastrophic failures. He demanded answers. He demanded that the prophet, the wretched seer Calchas, who knew the threads of fate better than any mortal, finally speak the truth, no matter how terrible the consequence. Calchas, shivering, terrified not of the army, but of the man who led it, reluctantly stepped forward. He demanded Achilles swear protection before he uttered a single syllable. Knowing the truth would ignite the High King's legendary, self-destructive rage. Achilles readily swore it, his massive bronze shield a promise of divine protection, challenging Agamemnon without even looking at him.
Then the words dropped like stones. Apollo was enraged because Agamemnon had stolen Chryseis, the daughter of the god's priest, Chryses, and refused the ransom, insulting the sanctity of the divine office. The girl must be returned, untouched, and without delay, or the plague would consume them all.
The air shattered. Agamemnon's face turned the color of dried wine, his eyes burning with the manic intensity of a man losing control of his entire world. He howled that he was being robbed, humiliated, and scapegoated in front of his entire army. He agreed to return the girl, but only under one absolute, non-negotiable condition. He would not be the only Achaean king without his due reward. The prize he lost, a symbol of his honor, must be instantly replaced by one seized from another leader. The assembly gasped, recognizing the suicidal madness in his demand. The implication hung heavy. He was going to take the most valuable woman in the camp, the ultimate war prize, the one belonging to the greatest warrior. Achilles, who had been simmering with barely contained fury since the day they landed, finally unleashed the storm. He accused Agamemnon of being the most grasping, profit-mad king in history, a leader who hid safely behind the lines while others bled for his ambition.
He reminded the High King that they were not fighting this war for Agamemnon's benefit, but because of his own oath and duty to Menelaus. If Agamemnon dared touch his prize, the beautiful Briseis, Achilles swore by every god in Olympus, he and his fearsome Myrmidons would board their ships and sail instantly home, leaving the Achaean cause to crumble into dust.
It was the ultimate threat, a line drawn in the sand, daring the High King to destroy his own army for the sake of wounded ego. Agamemnon, fueled by divine right and sheer arrogance, ignored the threat.
He sneered that Achilles was nothing but a pampered brute, easily replaced, and declared that he would take Briseis, making a point of seizing the woman who symbolized Achilles' honor and worth. As the High King spoke the fatal words, Achilles' hand instinctively flew to the hilt of his massive sword, the air crackling with impending fratricide.
The war was about to end before it truly began, slain by internal betrayal. But just as the bronze blade began to slide from the scabbard, a divine chill descended. Athena, the gray-eyed goddess of wisdom and war, materialized, visible only to Achilles. She grabbed his hair painfully, pulling his head back, her voice a low, terrifying hiss in his ear. He must restrain himself. He could attack the king with words, but not with steel, or the consequences would be unimaginable. Shaken by the goddess's invisible grip, Achilles slammed his sword back into its sheath, his rage now redirected into a cold, devastating hatred. He threw his scepter, the very symbol of his authority, to the ground, swearing the most binding oath of his life. He swore that the day would come when Agamemnon would desperately need him, when Hector's fires would consume the ships, and on that day Achilles would refuse to lift a finger, watching the annihilation with stony indifference. The old King Nestor, the smooth-talking moderator, tried desperately to salvage the situation, urging calm and respect. But the rift was too profound, the poison too potent. Agamemnon was deaf to reason, blinded by the necessity of asserting his supreme authority, even if it meant sacrificing the war effort. He sent heralds to seize Briseis immediately. The heralds, terrified, approached Achilles' tent. They found the great warrior, the breaker of men, slumped in silence. He did not resist. He simply let the beautiful Briseis, weeping silently, be led away like common plunder by the High King's messengers. It was not just the loss of the woman that broke him, but the absolute, crushing humiliation of being treated as a secondary asset by the man he was protecting. His honor, the only thing he truly possessed, had been brutally violated.
He watched the woman disappear into the distance,
then turned and walked to the shore, tears streaming down his face. The tears of a demigod, a warrior who knew he was too great for the petty squabbles of mortal kings. He cried out for his mother, the silver-footed nymph, Thetis, demanding divine justice for the insult that tore his soul apart.
Thetis, hearing the desperate cry of her beloved, short-lived son, rose instantly from the deep, vast gray of the sea. She found him sobbing on the shore, gripping her knees, begging her to intervene with Zeus, the cloud-gatherer, himself. Thetis agreed, knowing the terrible bloodshed this request would unleash upon the world. She flew instantly to Olympus, seeking a private, desperate audience with the Father of gods and men, sealing the fate of thousands more warriors. The High King's pride had not just cracked the alliance, it had guaranteed the immediate, devastating defeat of the entire Greek campaign. The stage was now tragically reset for the Trojans to finally taste victory, unaware that the true tide of war was about to turn, ironically, in their favor, thanks entirely to the petty, blinding rage of the man who led the invaders.
The absence of one man, the greatest warrior the world had ever known, did not just shift the balance of power, it shattered the Achaean lines into glittering dust. Achilles, the son of the sea nymph, sat silently in his tent, nursing a wound of ego deeper than any spear could inflict, while outside his comrades were drowning in the tide of Trojan steel. This was the catastrophic price of pride, the true cost of offending a demigod's honor, and King Agamemnon watched his 10 years of investment evaporate in smoke and terror.
The ships, those magnificent black hulls that had carried the elite of Hellas across the Aegean, were now their prison walls, the final defensive perimeter against the furious onslaught led by Prince Hector. The Trojans, smelling victory for the first time since the war began, pressed hard, roaring the names of their fallen brothers, fueled by a righteous fury that had been suppressed for a decade.
Agamemnon, the once proud commander, the architect of this entire grand invasion, was forced to confront the impossible truth. Without Achilles, they were merely scattered sheep waiting for the slaughter. He called the council, his face pale and etched with defeat, proposing the unthinkable, the ultimate surrender: load the ships, abandon the siege, and flee back to Greece, tail between their legs, forever marked by this failure. But the resolve of the true heroes, Diomedes, the ferocious Tydides, and the cunning Odysseus, the mastermind from Ithaca, held fast. They reminded the king that retreat was not an option. They were too far invested, too deeply stained by Trojan blood to simply sail home. They must fight, yes, but first they must grovel. Thus began the most humiliating diplomatic mission in the history of the Achaeans, the Great Embassy. Agamemnon, the king of kings, prepared a hoard of treasures so vast, so blindingly magnificent,
It was meant to drown Achilles in wealth and apology. 7 tripods untouched by fire, 10 talents of gold, 20 dazzling cauldrons, 12 prize-winning horses, and the 7 captive women he had never yet touched.
And most crucially, the promise to return Briseis, sworn upon the Styx that she was completely undefiled, untouched by his royal hands. He even offered to marry Achilles to one of his own daughters upon their return to Argos, granting him 7 cities as a dowry, a promise that would make him richer and more powerful than Agamemnon himself. It was everything a mortal man could ever dream of, the ultimate recompense for an injured ego, designed to buy back the war. The envoys chosen were the finest minds and strongest hearts. Odysseus, the silver-tongued orator who could charm the very fates. The mighty Ajax, a man whose presence spoke volumes of silent respect and shared battle. And Phoenix, the old mentor, the man who had raised Achilles since childhood, speaking with the authority of a heartbroken father. They walked silently toward the tent of the Myrmidons, carrying the fate of the entire Achaean army on their shoulders, praying to every god that the rage of Peleus' son had finally subsided. They found Achilles not brooding in despair, but singing, strumming the lyre, accompanied by his loyal companion Patroclus. When Odysseus began his careful, calculated appeal, his voice measured and grave, laying out the king's staggering, desperate offer, the atmosphere turned colder than the Aegean winter. Achilles listened, his eyes unreadable, the description of the gifts gleaming uselessly in the torchlight of his mind. When Odysseus finished, the demigod spoke, and his words were a dagger plunged into the heart of the entire Greek honor system, sharp and chillingly rational. He didn't just reject the gifts, he rejected the entire structure of Agamemnon's authority and the very purpose of their war. Hateful to me as the gates of Hades is the man who hides one thing in his heart and speaks another, Achilles declared, dismantling the king's apology with surgical precision. He pointed out the staggering hypocrisy. Why should he risk his life fighting for Agamemnon's honor when Agamemnon had so carelessly destroyed his? The gifts were meaningless because they could not buy back the ultimate prize, a long, peaceful life. Achilles knew his destiny was a terrible equation. He could either stay and fight, achieve eternal, blazing glory, but die young outside the walls of Troy. Or he could sail home to Phthia, live a long, comfortable life, but be forgotten entirely by the bards of history. He chose neither in that moment. He chose vengeance against Agamemnon by agonizing public inaction. He coldly informed the envoys that he would not lift a finger until Hector reached his own ships and started burning them. He rejected the 7 cities, the daughters, and the mountains of gold. He told Phoenix, his old mentor, that his loyalty was appreciated, but his advice was moot. He told Ajax, the great defender, that he respected his presence, but his plea was useless.
The embassy failed spectacularly. It was a total, crushing defeat for the Achaean morale, signaling that the divine judgment against Agamemnon was final and absolute. The heroes returned to the assembly, reporting Achilles' impenetrable, terrifying resolve. The Greeks sank into despair, realizing that their only hope for victory had just explicitly refused to save them. The stage was set for the deepest darkness of the war. With Achilles immobile, the gods themselves seemed to favor Troy, fulfilling the promise Zeus had made to Thetis to punish the arrogance of the Achaean king. Now he delivered that punishment through the unstoppable, terrifying force of Prince Hector. The Trojan champion, sensing the fear radiating from the Achaean lines, drove his forces forward with renewed savagery. He was no longer just defending the city. He was actively dismantling the invasion fleet, seeking to end the war in a single, fiery night. The fighting raged right up to the palisade the Achaeans had hastily built to protect their ships, a desperate wooden barrier against the tide of destiny. The Greeks had to use every ounce of courage simply to hold their ground, fighting not for glory or Helen, but for sheer, desperate survival. They knew that if the palisade fell and the Trojans breached their defensive ditch, the burning of the ships would commence, trapping them all thousands of miles from home, guaranteeing their annihilation. In the deepest hours of that terrifying night, when the Trojan watchfires glittered ominously close, Agamemnon and Menelaus were shaken awake by the terrible necessity of their situation. They needed intelligence. They needed a plan that did not involve pleading with the demigod. This desperation led to the infamous Doloneia, the night raid, a plan conceived by Odysseus and Diomedes to infiltrate the Trojan camp under the cover of darkness. They called for volunteers, seeking a brave soul willing to risk instant death for the army's safety, a secret mission to turn the tide. A nervous Trojan spy named Dolon was captured, a simple, foolish man, lured by the promise of Achilles' horses, and under brutal interrogation, he revealed everything: the precise deployment of the Trojan forces, their weary state, their allied contingents, including the newly arrived Thracian king Rhesus, whose magnificent horses were legendary, and their utter complacency regarding a night attack. This moment, born from utter despair and the threat of total destruction, provided a flicker of deadly hope. Diomedes and Odysseus, two shadows in the suffocating blackness, would now commit an act of brutal espionage and murder, shifting the narrative back toward Achaean capability, even without the terrible, unforgiving might of the raging son of Peleus. The war was turning feral, entering its most ruthless phase, and the heroes were ready to meet the night with vengeance.